Hey friends, welcome back. I'm Joe, and as usual, today we have a couple of scary stories for you. But before we begin, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because that's really important to me to make this channel grow. I also want to know where do you come from and what time are you watching this video. So without further ado, I don't want to waste your time. Dim the light, pull up your blanket, or do whatever you do to relax. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. Let's begin.
I should probably start by saying I don't scare easily. I grew up on a farm outside of Terre Haute, Indiana, and if you grow up around grain silos and dead quiet fields at 4 a.m. during harvest season, you get used to being alone in the dark. Nothing about being outside at night used to bother me. I want that on record before I tell you what happened at the house on Larkspur Lane, because for a long time afterward, people who heard the story assumed I was just a jumpy city kid who'd never spent a night outdoors. I wasn't. That's part of why it still gets to me. This was the summer of 2019. I was 26, and my girlfriend at the time, Megan, and I had just closed on our first house together. A single-story ranch on the edge of a small town called Fairview, about 40 minutes outside Columbus. It wasn't a fancy place. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a detached garage that leaned a little to the left, and a backyard that was almost comically large for the price we paid. Nearly 2 acres, most of it grass that hadn't been mowed in what looked like a year, sloping gently down toward a tree line that marked the edge of our property and the start of a stretch of undeveloped woods that, according to the county plat map, ran for almost a mile before hitting the next subdivision. We loved the yard immediately. Megan grew up in an apartment in Cleveland and had never had more than a concrete patio to call her own, so the idea of a real backyard, somewhere we could put up a hammock, plant a garden, maybe get a dog, was enough to make her cry a little during the final walkthrough. I remember standing out there with her that first weekend, both of us just soaking in how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no neighbors close enough to hear their TVs. Just crickets and wind moving through the trees at the edge of the property and the occasional distant bark of a dog from somewhere down the road. We spent that first Saturday just walking the property line, figuring out where exactly our 2 acres ended and the county-owned woods began. There was an old, rusted survey stake about 40 feet into the tree line that the inspector had pointed out during closing, half swallowed by brush, marking the actual boundary. Beyond that stake, according to the paperwork, was undeveloped land that technically belonged to the county and had been slated for a housing development that never went through after the 2008 crash. It had just sat there ever since, growing wild, connecting to another patch of woods, and eventually, miles later, to a state forest. Megan joked that we basically had our own private nature preserve. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was one of the best parts of the whole property. It's strange now, looking back, how much of that first month felt like exactly the life we'd pictured for ourselves. We grilled out most weekends. We bought a cheap, inflatable pool from Walmart and set it up near the patio, since neither of us could afford a real one yet. Megan started a little herb garden and raised beds along the side of the house. For those first few weeks, the size and quiet of that backyard felt like nothing but a gift. The only thing that gave me pause, if I'm being honest, happened on our second day there, before we'd even finished unpacking. Our next-door neighbor, an older guy named Walt Higgins, who'd lived on Larkspur for something like 30 years, came by to introduce himself and welcome us to the street. He was friendly enough, the kind of guy who talks with his hands and calls everyone buddy, but at one point he looked past me, out toward our backyard and the tree line beyond it, and his whole demeanor shifted for just a second. "You two mind the woods back there," he said. "Not a question. Nothing wrong with them. Exactly. Just keep an eye on things after dark, is all. Old habit around here." I asked him what he meant, and he sort of laughed it off, said something about deer and coyotes getting into people's trash, and changed the subject to asking if we needed help moving the couch. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every small town has a guy like Walt who talks a little strange and means nothing by it. Looking back now, I think about that conversation more than almost anything else that summer. The first few weeks were completely normal. We unpacked, we painted the guest room, we spent our weekends at the hardware store buying things for a garden that never really got planted because we both worked full-time and were exhausted every evening. Megan taught 3rd grade and had the summer off, so she was usually the first one up, and I worked as a project coordinator for a construction firm in Columbus, which meant I left the house around 6:45 every morning and usually didn't get home until after 6. The first strange thing happened in the 2nd week of June, small enough that neither of us thought anything of it at the time. I came home from work one evening and Megan mentioned that our motion sensor porch light, the one on a pole near the back patio facing the yard, had been going off randomly all day, not just once or twice. She said it had triggered probably a dozen times between the time I left for work and when I got home, sometimes multiple times in a row, sometimes with big gaps in between. She'd gone out and checked a few times, assuming it was a rabbit or a stray cat, but never saw anything. I checked the sensitivity settings that night, figured maybe it was just picking up on the tall grass swaying in the wind, since we still hadn't gotten around to mowing the back half of the property. I turned the sensitivity down and didn't think about it again, except it kept happening. Over the next week, almost every single night, that light would trip at some point between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. I started noticing it because our bedroom window faced the backyard, and the light was bright enough that it would flood in through the blinds and wake me up. I'd get up, look out, see nothing but grass and the dark line of trees, and go back to bed. After the 3rd or 4th night of this, I stopped even bothering to look. I just figured it was some animal that had found a route across our yard it liked, a rabbit or a raccoon establishing a nightly pattern, and eventually I'd get used to sleeping through it. Megan, though, mentioned something around the 3rd week of June that stuck with me a little more. She'd been out back around dusk, sitting on the patio with a book, and said she felt like she was being watched. Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't scared, she said, just aware of it, the way you sometimes are when someone's looking at you from across a room. She scanned the tree line a few times and didn't see anything, chalked it up to nerves about the new house, and went back inside when the mosquitoes got bad. I want to be clear that at this point, nothing about any of this felt like a horror story. It felt like the normal background noise of living next to undeveloped woods for the first time. Deer, rabbits, the occasional raccoon rummaging through the garbage. That's what we told ourselves. And honestly, that's probably what most of it was. Around this same time, our other neighbor on the opposite side, a woman named Diane Kowalski, who'd lived on the street for about 8 years, mentioned something in passing that I didn't think much of until much later. She was out walking her golden retriever one evening while I was mowing the front yard, and when I mentioned we were still getting used to how much wildlife activity we had at night, she got a strange look on her face and said something like, "You're on the Whitfield place, aren't you?" I told her yes, that was the name on some of the old paperwork from closing, and she just nodded slowly, said something non-committal about how every house has its quirks, and continued on her walk before I could ask her anything else. It wasn't until weeks later that the name Whitfield would come up again and mean something very different. The first real turning point came at the very end of June, right around the 4th of July weekend. We'd had some friends over for a cookout on the Saturday before the holiday. My buddy Nate and his wife, and Megan's sister Claire and her husband. It was a good night. We grilled, we had a few beers, we sat out on the patio until almost midnight watching some neighbors down the road set off fireworks early. Everyone left around 12:30, and Megan and I stayed out cleaning up the yard for a bit before finally heading to bed close to 1:30 a.m. I remember being tired enough that I fell asleep almost instantly. What woke me up, sometime later, was Megan's hand gripping my arm. She was sitting up in bed, completely still, staring at the window. When I asked what was wrong, she didn't answer right away. She just pointed. Our bedroom window looked out over the side yard, not directly into the backyard, but you could see a decent slice of the grass and the edge of the tree line from that angle if the blinds were open, which they were that night because of the heat. Megan said she'd woken up because she heard something outside. She described it later as a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the grass. And when she looked out the window, she saw someone standing at the edge of the trees. Just standing there, not moving. She said it was too dark to make out any real detail, just a shape, tall, definitely a person and not an animal, facing the house. By the time I was fully awake and looking myself, there was nothing there. I got up, walked through the house, checked every window and the back door, which was locked. I didn't see anyone, and I told Megan it was probably just a neighbor out walking their dog, or maybe even one of our friends who'd forgotten something and hadn't wanted to knock at 2 in the morning. She didn't seem convinced, but she was tired enough that she eventually fell back asleep. I stayed up for a while after that, sitting in the living room with the lights off, watching the backyard through the window. Nothing happened. Eventually I went back to bed too. The next morning, I went out to check the yard in daylight, mostly to put my own mind at ease. And that's when I found the first thing that actually unsettled me. Where the grass met the tree line, maybe 15 feet from the property line, there was a patch of grass that had clearly been flattened. Not mowed, just pressed down in a rough rectangle about the size of a car hood. It looked like something had either been dragged through there or had been lying there for a while. I couldn't find footprints in the grass around it since the ground had been dry all week, but the flattened patch itself was undeniable. I didn't tell Megan how much that bothered me. I told her it was probably deer bedding down, which is a real thing that deer do, and for a while that explanation held. Things were quiet again for almost 2 weeks after that. The motion lights still tripped some nights, but not every night anymore, and neither of us saw anyone else standing at the tree line. We started to relax a little. I remember Megan even joking about it by mid-July, saying maybe we had a shy deer that liked to watch us barbecue. Then, on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of July, our garbage cans got knocked over. This isn't inherently strange. It happens to everyone eventually, usually raccoons. Except that both cans, which were heavy plastic ones with locking lids, had been dragged almost 30 feet from where we kept them by the garage, all the way across the side yard, and left on their sides near the fence line that separated our property from Walt's. The lids were still on. Nothing had been eaten out of them or spread across the yard, which is what you'd expect from an animal. They'd just been moved. I mentioned this to Walt the next day when I saw him getting his mail, half joking about needing to invest in bungee cords. He didn't laugh. He asked me, pretty directly, if we'd been seeing anything unusual back near the woods. I told him about the motion light, and hesitantly about the night Megan saw someone standing at the tree line. Walt got quiet for a second, and then told me something that changed how I thought about the whole summer. He said that about 4 years earlier, before we'd bought the house, the family that lived there before us, the Whitfields, had moved out abruptly, less than 2 years into owning the place, and that there had always been rumors around the neighborhood about why. Some people said money problems, but Walt said the wife had told his own wife, before they left, that someone had been coming into their yard at night. Not stealing anything, not vandalizing anything, just coming into the yard and standing there, sometimes for hours, and that on at least one occasion, the husband had gone out to confront whoever it was and found nobody there, despite swearing he'd seen someone only seconds before. Walt said the Whitfields called the police a few times, but nothing ever came of it. No suspects, no evidence beyond some flattened grass and a few footprints that never matched to anyone in the area. Eventually, they just left, sold the house fast and for less than it was worth, and moved to Michigan to be near her parents. I asked Walt why he hadn't mentioned any of this before we bought the house. He looked genuinely uncomfortable and said something I still think about. Didn't want to scare off good neighbors over something that's probably nothing. And besides, nobody's ever actually gotten hurt. It's just unsettling, is all. Most people who buy that house, nothing happens to them at all. Maybe it's nothing this time either. That conversation should have been the moment we did something. Called the police preemptively, installed real security cameras, talked to a realtor about our options. Instead, like a lot of people probably do when they're 26 years old and 3 months into owning their first house, we mostly just got a little more careful and hoped it would stay quiet. We started locking every door and window every night, even in the July heat, which meant running the AC harder than we wanted to. We stopped leaving the blinds open in the bedroom. I did buy a cheap trail camera that weekend, the kind hunters use to monitor deer activity, motion activated with infrared night vision, and mounted it on a tree at the edge of our property facing back toward the house, angled to catch anything crossing the open part of the yard. For the first several days, it caught exactly what you'd expect: a family of rabbits. A raccoon working its way along the fence line one night. A deer and 2 fawns crossing at dusk. Genuinely nice stuff, actually. Megan and I got kind of into scrolling through the images each morning, laughing about the animals, feeling a little silly for how worried we'd let ourselves get. Then, on the night of July 24th, the camera caught something else. The timestamp was 2:47 a.m. The image was grainy, black and white from the infrared, but unmistakably a person, standing at the very edge of the frame near the tree line, facing directly toward the camera, toward our house. Not walking, not doing anything, just standing there, arms at their sides, head tilted very slightly, like they were looking at something specific. There was a second image, taken 4 minutes later at 2:51 a.m. Same spot, same posture. Barely anything had changed, except that the figure seemed to have taken one step closer. We called the police that morning and showed them both photos. They took a report, said they'd increase patrols on our street, and told us, reasonably, I suppose, that a person standing on the edge of a property at night isn't technically illegal unless they're trespassing on the moment they're caught, and by the time an officer could respond to a 2-minute window of activity from hours earlier, there was nothing to act on. They did say the images were disturbing enough to keep on file in case anything else happened. Something else happened 3 nights later. We'd started sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed by that point, which in retrospect feels almost quaint, given what came after, but that's genuinely where our heads were at. Around 1 a.m. on the 27th, I woke up to the sound of our back door, the one leading out to the patio from the kitchen, rattling in its frame. Not being knocked on. Rattling, like someone was testing the handle, trying it slowly and quietly to see if it would give. I got up immediately, grabbed the bat, and told Megan to call 911 and stay in the bedroom. I walked out through the hallway toward the kitchen, and the rattling stopped the second I stepped into the room. I stood there for what felt like a long time, watching the door, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my ears. Through the small window in the top half of the door, I could see out onto the patio, and for a second, just a second, I thought I saw a shape moving away from the door, off to the side, out of the porch light's reach. I didn't open the door. I know some people would say I should have, but everything in me said not to. I stayed in that kitchen with the bat until I heard sirens approaching maybe 10 minutes later, and only then did I turn on every light in the house and open the door for the responding officer. They searched the property with flashlights for almost 40 minutes. Checked the shed at the back of our lot. A small, half-collapsed wooden structure that had come with the house and that we'd never bothered clearing out. Checked along the fence line, checked into the tree line about 50 feet in either direction. They found something that made the whole situation feel very different from a raccoon or a bored teenager messing with the new neighbors. Near the base of a tree just inside the woods, maybe 20 feet past our property line, they found a section of ground that had clearly been used as some kind of camp. Not tents or anything elaborate, just flattened grass and leaves in a rough circle, a couple of empty plastic water bottles, and a folded up section of a tarp that looked like it had been used as a ground cover. It didn't look recent, exactly, the officer said, but it also didn't look old. Weeks, maybe, not months or years. They didn't find any personal belongings, nothing with a name on it, nothing that could immediately identify who'd been using the spot. They took photos, bagged the water bottles for prints, and told us they'd increase patrols significantly, and recommended we consider a full security camera system rather than a single trail cam, plus motion lights around every side of the house rather than just the back. One of the responding officers, a younger guy named Reyes, who seemed to take the whole thing more seriously than his partner, pulled me aside before they left that night and asked, a little carefully, whether we knew anything about the history of the house. I told him what Walt had mentioned about the Whitfields moving out abruptly a few years back. Reyes said he hadn't been on the force long enough to remember that specific case personally, but that the name had come up once before, in a report he'd read during training about a string of minor trespassing complaints on this stretch of road going back almost a decade. Never anything that amounted to charges, never a suspect they could hold on to, just recurring reports of someone seen standing at the edge of different properties along Larkspur and the road that connected to it, always at night, always gone by the time anyone responded. He said it in a flat, professional tone, like he was just relaying facts, but I remember the way he glanced back toward the tree line while he said it, like he wanted to make sure of something before he got back in his cruiser. I didn't sleep much that night, turning that conversation over and over. A string of complaints going back a decade meant this wasn't specific to us, or even to the Whitfields. It meant something had been quietly circling this small stretch of road for years, moving from yard to yard, house to house, and that eventually it always moved on. Until, for whatever reason, it didn't, and settled somewhere for a while. I didn't share all of that with Megan right away. I didn't want her more scared than she already was, and some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to believe we could ride this out and keep the house we'd just spent our savings on. We did both of those things within the week. I also, against Megan's mild objection, bought a shotgun. The first firearm I'd ever owned in my adult life, despite growing up around guns on the farm, and kept it, unloaded but with ammunition close by in the bedroom closet. I also called my dad, mostly just to talk it through with someone who'd know what to make of it. He'd spent 30 years on that farm and had his own stories about strange nights, though nothing quite like what we were dealing with. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which wasn't like him, and when I finished, he just said, "You get a bad feeling about a place. You don't stick around trying to prove yourself wrong. That's how people get hurt." I told him we'd already put too much into the house to just walk away, and he didn't push it, but I could tell he wasn't happy with that answer. Neither was I, really, if I'm being honest. I think some part of both Megan and me knew even then that we were staying longer than we should have, out of stubbornness more than anything else. A refusal to let some unseen person chase us out of the first home we'd ever owned together. Around the same time, I started researching the property's history more seriously, pulling old county records and searching the local paper's online archive for anything mentioning Larkspur Lane. Most of what I found was mundane. Permit filings, a small item about a downed tree during a 2016 storm, a photo from a neighborhood 4th of July parade in 2014 that happened to include our house in the background, looking almost exactly the same as it did now. But I did find one short article from about 6 years earlier, barely 3 paragraphs, about a resident 2 streets over reporting an intruder who'd been seen standing motionless in their backyard for nearly 20 minutes before fleeing when the homeowner turned on the lights. No arrest was made. The article didn't speculate on a motive or connect it to any other incidents, and there was no follow-up piece that I could find. It was easy to imagine, reading it, that whatever this was had been quietly working its way through the neighborhood for years, long before we ever showed up, patient in a way that made my stomach turn every time I thought about it too long. For the first several nights after the police found that camp, nothing happened. The new cameras, 4 of them now, covering every angle of the house, caught nothing but the usual wildlife. We started, cautiously, to relax again, though neither of us slept as deeply as we had before that summer started. I remember thinking, somewhat guiltily, that maybe whoever had been out there had been scared off by the police search, found the attention wasn't worth it, and moved on to some other quiet property where nobody would notice him. I was wrong, and the 2 weeks that followed were the worst of that entire summer, and honestly, of my life up to that point. It started again on August 2nd. Megan had gone to visit her sister in Cleveland for the weekend, which meant I was alone in the house for the first time since everything had started. I want to be honest and say that I wasn't scared to be alone. If anything, I felt a strange sense of readiness, like I'd rather be the one dealing with it directly than have Megan there and worried. That confidence didn't last long. Around 11:30 p.m. that Friday, the cameras picked up motion at the back corner of the yard. I was still awake, sitting in the living room with the security app open on my phone out of habit at that point, and I watched the footage come through almost live. It was the same figure, same build, as far as I could tell from the grainy footage. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like dark, loose clothing. This time, though, instead of standing still at the tree line, he was walking. Slowly, deliberately, straight across the open part of the backyard, directly toward the house. I called 911 immediately, gave them the address, and told them what I was watching happen in real time. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me and told me to get somewhere secure and lock myself in, which I did. I went into the bedroom, locked the door, and got the shotgun out of the closet, loading it with hands that weren't shaking as much as I expected them to be, given everything. Through the app, I watched him cross the yard entirely, disappear from the backyard camera's view, and reappear 30 seconds later on the side camera, walking along the length of the house, close enough to the siding now that I could hear, faintly, actual footsteps on the gravel path that ran along that side of the property, audible even through the closed bedroom window. He stopped directly below what I knew was the kitchen window. And then the footsteps stopped too. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher the entire time, describing everything as it happened, and she assured me officers were about 4 minutes out. Those 4 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat on the edge of the bed, shotgun across my lap, staring at the door, listening for any sound at all beyond my own breathing and the low hum of the AC. At some point during that wait, and I want to be as precise as I can here, because this is the part that still keeps me up some nights, I heard a voice from just outside the bedroom window. Low, male. Not shouting, not aggressive sounding in tone, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. I couldn't make out most of what he said. Some of it might not even have been words in the way I understood them. It might have just been a low murmuring, the kind of sound someone makes when they're talking to themselves. But one phrase came through clearly enough that I've never been able to shake it, and it's the reason I still, 5 years later, keep every door and window in whatever house I'm living in locked well before dark, no matter the season. He said, quiet and almost gentle, "I just want to see inside." I didn't respond. I didn't move. I sat completely frozen on that bed with the gun in my lap, staring at the window, watching the blinds for any hint of movement, any shadow, anything at all. The voice didn't come again. What came instead, maybe 10 or 15 seconds later, was the sound of the police cruiser's siren, still probably a minute out but audible in the night air, and this is the part the responding officers couldn't ever fully explain to my satisfaction. Silence. No footsteps retreating. No sound of him moving through the grass, or the gravel, or the woods at all. Just nothing. When the officers arrived and swept the property, they found nothing. No one in the yard, no one in the woods within the immediate search radius, no fresh tracks that they could distinguish in the dry summer grass. They did find directly below the kitchen window. Not the bedroom window, which is where I'd assumed the voice came from, but around the corner at the kitchen. A single handprint pressed into the dust on the sill of the low, ground-level window that led to our unfinished basement. A window, I hadn't even known was accessible from ground level until that night, since it was mostly obscured by overgrown shrubs. That was, as far as I know, the last time anyone or anything approached the house directly. But it wasn't the end of that summer, not for us. Megan came home the next day, and we made the decision within about an hour of her walking through the door that we weren't staying. I don't think either of us said it out loud as dramatically as it probably sounds now. It was more of a quiet, mutual understanding, the kind you reach with someone you trust completely, that this house, this yard, whatever was out there past that tree line, wasn't something either of us was willing to keep gambling our safety on. We stayed with Megan's sister in Cleveland for the following 2 weeks while we figured out next steps, only going back to the house during daylight hours in pairs to pack what we needed. I want to mention, because it's the detail that still bothers me most, even now, that during one of those daytime visits, early afternoon, bright sun, both of us there together, feeling about as safe as we possibly could. I walked out to check on the trail camera one last time before we planned to sell the house. The camera's SD card had captured something from 2 nights before Megan came home, something that hadn't triggered an alert because the motion had been just outside the camera's detection range, caught only at the very edge of the frame by chance during a longer recording window the camera did automatically once an hour, regardless of motion. It was a single frame, dark, at the very edge of the image, barely visible even after I brightened it as much as I could on my laptop later that night. But it was there. A face. I say face, though calling it that gives it more definition than the image actually showed, angled toward the camera itself, not toward the house. Like whoever it was had known exactly where the camera was mounted the entire time, and on that particular night, for whatever reason, had wanted to look directly into it instead. We sold the house that fall, at a loss, to a young couple from Columbus who I sincerely hope never experienced anything close to what we did. I never told them the full story before closing. Legally, in Ohio, You're not required to disclose something like that if there's no documented crime tied to a specific individual. And honestly, some combination of guilt and self-preservation kept me from bringing it up beyond a vague mention of some issues with trespassers. I've thought about that decision a lot since then, and I'm still not entirely at peace with it. Before we left for good, I did try one more time to get real answers, mostly for my own peace of mind. I drove out to see Walt one last time, a few days before the moving truck came, and asked him directly whether he thought whoever this was had ever actually hurt anyone in all the years he'd lived on that street. He thought about it for a long moment before answering, which told me almost as much as whatever he was about to say. He said he genuinely didn't know of a case where it had gone further than what happened to us. No one badly hurt, no one who'd simply vanished, at least not that he was aware of in 3 decades on Larkspur. But he said it in a way that made clear he wasn't entirely confident in that answer, more like it was the version of events he'd chosen to believe because the alternative was too unsettling to sit with while still living 20 yards from where it kept happening. He told me he was sorry he hadn't said more before we bought the place, and I told him I understood why he hadn't. I'm not sure that was entirely true, but it felt like the right thing to say to a man who'd lived with that uncertainty far longer than we had, and who wasn't going anywhere. Megan and I got married 2 years later, and we live now in a townhouse in the suburbs of Columbus with no yard to speak of beyond a small concrete patio, which honestly, most days, is exactly how we like it. We never went back to Larkspur Lane, not even to drive past it, though I did look the property up online once, a few years after we sold it. The listing photos showed the backyard freshly mowed, a swing set installed near where our trail camera used to hang, a family clearly enjoying their new home. I hope, for their sake, that whatever was out there past our tree line that summer moved on to somewhere else entirely, or simply stopped, the way these things sometimes do without any explanation at all. But I still think about Walt Higgins standing in our driveway that first week, telling us to keep an eye on things after dark, like it was just some old habit of the neighborhood. I've talked to Megan about it more times than either of us can count, usually late at night when neither of us can sleep, trying to make sense of what exactly we lived next to for those few months. We've never landed on an answer that satisfies either of us. Part of me still wants it to have been a person, a drifter, someone unwell, someone with a fixation on empty-feeling houses on quiet roads. Because a person, however dangerous, is at least something you can eventually understand, or be found, or be stopped. A person eventually grows old, or moves away, or gets caught. The alternative, the one neither of us likes to say out loud, is that it wasn't really about us at all, or even about that specific house, but about that stretch of woods itself, and that it's simply still out there right now, patient in a way nothing human usually manages to be, quietly deciding which yard along that road it wants to stand at the edge of next. And some nights, even now, in a townhouse with no woods anywhere near it, I still find myself checking that the doors are locked twice before I can fall asleep. Story number 2. I need to preface this by saying I've never told this story in full to anyone except my sister, and even she thinks I'm exaggerating parts of it because that's easier for both of us than the alternative. But it's been 6 years now, and I still can't fall asleep without a nightlight on in a house that's 40 miles from the one where any of this happened, so I don't think I'm exaggerating anything. If anything, I've probably softened it in my memory just to be able to function. My name doesn't matter for this, but I'll tell you the basics. I was 29 that summer, recently divorced, and had used my half of the settlement to buy a small house on the outskirts of a town called Brandenburg, about 40 minutes south of Louisville, Kentucky. It was more house than I needed for just me. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, and an in-ground pool in the backyard that the previous owners had put in maybe a decade earlier. I'd never had a pool before in my life, and honestly, it was the main reason I bought the place. I pictured a whole summer of quiet mornings swimming laps before work and evenings floating in it with a glass of wine, finally getting to enjoy something just for myself after 2 years of a marriage that hadn't given me much room to. The backyard itself was fenced in completely. 6-foot wood privacy fencing on all 3 sides that didn't border the house, which made me feel safe when I first looked at the listing. Beyond the back fence was a shallow drainage ditch and then a stretch of undeveloped land that the county used as a retention area during heavy rain, mostly scrubby brush and a few stands of half-dead trees, backing up eventually to the rear of a self-storage facility about a quarter-mile off. Nobody really went back there. It wasn't woods in the way you'd picture for a horror story. No dense canopy, nothing majestic about it. Just overgrown, empty, unremarkable land that nobody had any reason to be on. I remember the day of closing. My realtor, a friendly woman in her 50s named Pam Osei, who'd sold houses in that county for over 20 years, mentioned almost as an afterthought that the retention land behind the fence had flooded badly a few times over the past decade, once badly enough that the county had considered buying out a couple of the adjacent properties entirely before deciding it wasn't worth the cost. She said it mostly to explain why the lot had come cheap relative to similar houses closer to town, and I didn't think much of it beyond noting that I should probably keep an eye on the drainage during storms. It didn't occur to me at the time to ask what, if anything, lived or moved through land that flooded that regularly. I wish now that I had. I moved in at the very end of May, and for the first 3 weeks, that pool was everything I'd hoped it would be. I swam almost every morning before work, and most evenings I'd sit out on the little concrete patio with a book until it got too dark to read, then go back inside satisfied in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I want that part on the record too, because I think it matters that this didn't start as something dark. It started as maybe the happiest few weeks of my adult life up to that point. The pool had one of those in-wall LED lights, the kind that can cycle through colors if you want, though I mostly just left it on a steady white or pale blue for swimming at night. It ran on a timer connected to the pool's main electrical panel in the garage, set to come on automatically at dusk and shut off around midnight, mostly so I wouldn't forget and leave it running all night and run up my electric bill. The first strange thing I noticed, in the second week of June, was that the light would sometimes come on at odd hours. Not just at dusk like it was programmed, but occasionally in the middle of the afternoon, or, a few times, well past midnight when it should have already shut off. I checked the timer in the garage more than once and reset it, assuming it was just an old, slightly glitchy mechanism that came with the house. It never seemed like a big deal. If anything, it was mildly annoying, the kind of small maintenance issue that comes with owning an older home. Then, on a Tuesday night in the third week of June, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a pale blue glow coming through my bedroom curtains. My bedroom window faced the backyard and the pool directly, so this wasn't unusual on its own. The light had clearly turned on again outside its normal schedule. What made me actually get out of bed and look was a sound, a soft, rhythmic splashing, like someone swimming slow, deliberate laps. I stood at the window for a long moment before I worked up the nerve to actually pull the curtain back. When I did, I could see the pool clearly, lit up that pale blue from below, water rippling gently across the surface. There was no one visible in it, but the water was moving, not from wind, since the night was completely still, but the way water moves when something has recently passed through it, or is moving through it just below the surface where I couldn't quite see. I told myself it was the pool's circulation pump kicking on and creating current, even though some part of me knew that wasn't quite the same kind of movement. I went back to bed, and eventually back to sleep, and by morning had mostly convinced myself I'd imagined the splashing sound, half asleep and disoriented by the light waking me up. Over the next week and a half, this happened 3 more times, always between 1 and 3 a.m. Always the same pale glow through my curtains, the same soft, rhythmic sound of something moving through water. And every single time, when I worked up the nerve to look, the pool was empty. Just rippling water, lit from below, and no explanation for the movement. I mentioned it, cautiously, to my coworker Kaylee, who I'd become close with pretty quickly after starting my new job at a dental office in town. She laughed a little and said it was probably raccoons. She said they loved pools, that they'd climb the ladder and go for a swim sometimes, especially on hot nights, and that the splashing I was hearing was almost certainly some overweight, overly confident raccoon having the time of its life in my backyard. It made enough sense that I actually felt relieved hearing it. I started imagining, half fondly, a chubby raccoon doing laps in my pool at 2 a.m., and for a while, that image made the whole thing feel almost sweet instead of unsettling. That relief lasted until the first week of July, when I found the first thing that made the raccoon theory fall apart completely. I'd gone out one morning to skim the pool before work, something I did most days to keep leaves and bugs out of the filter. Near the deep end, on the concrete decking, I found a scatter of wet footprints. Human footprints, bare feet, clearly still damp when I found them around 6:30 in the morning. They led from the pool's edge across the patio toward the side gate that connected the backyard to the narrow side yard along the house, and then simply stopped a few feet from the gate itself, like whoever made them had either climbed over the fence there or, more unsettlingly, had just stopped existing at that exact point. I checked the gate, which was still latched and locked with the small combination padlock I always used. I checked the fence itself for any sign it had been climbed. No scuff marks, nothing disturbed, no broken slats. I stood there in my work clothes, coffee going cold in my hand, staring at footprints that led nowhere, and felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt since I was a kid afraid of the dark. I called the police that morning before work, more out of a need to have it documented than any real expectation they'd find something. The officer who came out was polite, but clearly considered this a low priority, probably nothing kind of call. He looked at the footprints, which had mostly dried by the time he got there around 10 a.m., checked the fence and gate himself, and told me it was likely a neighborhood kid who'd hopped the fence for a late-night swim and gotten spooked before finishing, possibly by a motion light or a dog, barking somewhere. It was a reasonable theory. I wanted badly to believe it. For about 2 weeks after that, things were quiet again. No unexpected pool light, no splashing, no footprints. I started sleeping through the night again, mostly, though I developed a habit of checking the backyard through the window before bed every night, just to put my mind at ease. During that quiet stretch, I did something I probably should have done from the very beginning. I asked around the neighborhood a little, the way you do when you're new somewhere and trying to get a read on a place. Most people were friendly, but had nothing useful to offer, just pleasant small talk about the neighborhood association and the best place to get your car serviced. But one conversation stuck with me. An older man 2 houses down, a retired electrician named Gary Thornbury who'd lived on that street since the early 90s, mentioned, almost offhandedly while we talked over his fence line, that the retention land behind our block had a reputation among the old-timers as a place kids were told not to go after dark, going back decades. When I asked why, he shrugged and said something vague about it, flooding easily and being unsafe underfoot, snakes and soft mud, and the kind of terrain you could twist an ankle in without seeing it coming. But there was a beat of hesitation before he said it, a half-second too long, that made me wonder even then whether that was the whole reason or just the version of the reason that was easiest to say to someone he barely knew. I let it go at the time. I had no reason yet to connect a childhood superstition about muddy retention land with a possibly imaginary raccoon in my pool. Looking back, I think that conversation was the last real chance I had to leave before things got as bad as they eventually did, and I didn't take it, because nothing yet felt urgent enough to justify walking away from a house I'd just spent months searching for. There was one more incident before that night, though, that I think about almost as much as everything that came after, because it's the moment I should have already been gone. On the night of July 14th, about 5 days before everything came to a head, I woke up around 1 a.m. to what I first thought was my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It wasn't. It was a low, steady, thrumming sound coming from somewhere outside, rhythmic enough that for a few groggy seconds I genuinely thought it was some kind of machinery, maybe a neighbor running a pool pump or a generator. I lay there trying to place it for a couple of minutes before I understood that it was coming from the direction of the pool and that it had a pattern to it. 3 low thrums, a pause, 3 more, over and over, evenly spaced, like a kind of signal. I got up, again moving as quietly as I could manage, and looked out the window without opening the curtain fully, just enough to see through the gap. The pool light was off this time, which was somehow worse than if it had been on, because the yard was almost entirely dark, except for the faint ambient light spilling over from a street lamp a few houses down. I couldn't see the water clearly at all, but I could see, near the base of the fence at the very back of the yard, a shape crouched low to the ground, almost animal in the way it held itself, perfectly still except for a very slight, continuous rocking motion, forward and back, in time with that thrumming sound. I didn't call the police that night. I want to be honest about that, because I've asked myself many times since why I didn't, and the truest answer I can give is that I was too frightened to move at all, let alone reach for a phone and speak coherently into it. I stood at that window for what felt like an eternity, watching that shape rock slowly against the fence line, until, without any warning or transition I could identify, it simply wasn't there anymore. 1 second it was crouched at the base of the fence. The next, the space where it had been was just empty grass, dark and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there at all. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up in bed with every light in the house on, texting Kaylee at nearly 2 in the morning, even though I knew she wouldn't see it until she woke up, just needing to put what I'd seen into words for someone, anyone, even if the reply wouldn't come for hours. When she did eventually respond the next morning, she offered to come stay with me for a few nights, which I gratefully accepted, and for those few nights with someone else in the house, nothing happened at all. I remember actually starting to wonder, foolishly, whether the problem had simply resolved itself, or whether having another person there had been enough to keep whatever it was away. Kaylee and I talked about it a lot during those few nights, staying up late in the living room with the TV on for noise, going in circles trying to come up with some explanation that would let us both relax even a little. She floated theories ranging from a neighbor with some kind of late-night obsession to only half joking by the second night, something supernatural, which I remember laughing off at the time, even though the joke landed uncomfortably close to what some quiet, unspoken part of me had already started to suspect. She was the one who first suggested I look into whether the house had a documented history, the same idea that eventually led me to track down the Delacroix family's daughter, though neither of us followed through on it until after everything had already happened. I've wondered many times since whether things would have gone differently if we'd pushed harder on that thread while she was still staying with me. Whether there was some piece of information sitting in an old file somewhere that could have gotten me out of that house before the worst of it. Kaylee had to go back to her own apartment on the evening of the 18th for a family obligation the next day, and I told her I'd be fine on my own, mostly because I didn't want to seem as dependent and frightened as I actually felt. That was the last night before everything happened, and looking back, I think whatever had been circling that pool for weeks had simply been waiting for me to be alone again. Then, on the night of July 19th, everything changed, and this is the part of the story I still have trouble getting all the way through, even now. I'd fallen asleep around 11 p.m. with my window cracked slightly, since the AC had been struggling to keep up with a heat wave that week, and I wanted the cross breeze. I woke up sometime later. I never got an exact time that night, because my phone had died on me. Charger without me realizing, to the sound of someone humming, not singing, not talking. Just a low, wandering hum, tuneless, coming from somewhere close outside. I lay perfectly still, straining to place where it was coming from, and slowly realized it was coming from the pool. I made myself get up, moving as quietly as I could, and looked out the window. The pool light was on, that pale blue glow washing over the whole backyard. And this time, unlike every time before, there was someone actually in the water. I want to describe this as carefully and honestly as I can, because I've turned it over in my memory 1,000 times since, trying to convince myself I saw less than I did, or that the dark and the panic distorted things. What I saw was a figure, from the shoulders up, floating motionless in the deep end near the light itself, facing my bedroom window directly. The humming had stopped the moment I appeared at the glass, like whoever, or whatever. It had noticed me the instant I looked out. I couldn't make out a face. The pale light coming up from below the water lit the figure from underneath in a way that put its features into strange, upward cast shadow, more suggestion than detail. But I could see, clearly, that its eyes were open, and that it was looking directly at me, without blinking, without any movement at all beyond the slow, gentle rise and fall of the water around it. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen at the window, it floating there watching me. It felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. I remember, absurdly, thinking about how the water around it wasn't rippling the way it should have been for something breathing or treading water or doing anything a living person would need to do to stay afloat. It was simply resting on the surface, weightless, as still as the deep end of that pool had ever looked in daylight, except for the eyes, which never once left the window and never once blinked. What finally broke it was the figure slowly, deliberately, beginning to move toward the shallow end, toward the steps that led up out of the pool and onto the patio, toward the house. It didn't swim the way a person swims. There was no visible stroke, No kicking, nothing I could point to and say, that's how it's moving. It simply glided, smooth and unbroken, the water parting around it in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up before my mind had even finished processing what I was watching. By the time it reached the shallow end, close enough now that the pale blue light caught more of it, I could see that it was, in silhouette at least, the shape of a person. A head, shoulders, arms hanging loosely at its sides. But something about the proportions was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate even to myself in the moment. Something too long about the arms, too still about the neck, that made every instinct I had scream that this wasn't a person at all, whatever it looked like from a distance. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I backed away from the window, grabbed my phone off the charger even though it only had about 8% battery, and locked myself in the bathroom down the hall, the one room in the house without a window at all. I called 911 with hands that could barely manage the numbers, and the dispatcher stayed on the line with me while officers made their way out. While I waited, locked in that windowless bathroom with my back against the door, I heard something I've never been able to fully explain to anyone, including myself. A soft, wet sound moving along the hallway outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like something dragging itself, slow and deliberate, pausing every few feet like it was listening for something. It came all the way down the hall, stopping. I was almost certain of this at the time, and I'm still certain now. Directly outside the bathroom door. Then nothing. No knocking, no attempt to open the door, no voice. Just a long, heavy silence on the other side of that door that felt, somehow, more frightening than any sound could have been. I stayed absolutely still. Phone pressed to my ear, listening to the dispatcher's calm voice telling me officers were 3 minutes out, and staring at the thin gap of darkness beneath the door, half convinced I could see a shadow shifting there, though I've never been sure if that part was real or just my mind filling in the worst possible detail. At one point during that silence, the dispatcher asked me gently if I could still hear or see anything, and I remember not being able to answer her right away, because I was concentrating so hard on the gap under the door that speaking felt like it might break whatever fragile stillness was keeping it on the other side rather than through it. When I finally did whisper back that I thought something was right outside, waiting, she told me to stay exactly where I was, not to open the door under any circumstances, and to keep talking to her quietly if I could manage it, just so she'd know I was still all right. I remember the strange comfort of her voice in that moment, steady and unhurried, like she'd talked 100 people through exactly this kind of thing before, even though some part of me doubted that anyone else had ever described quite what I was describing to her that night. Later, after everything, I found out from one of the responding officers that she'd flagged the call as high priority the moment I mentioned the wet dragging sound in the hallway, which was, apparently, not a detail 911 dispatchers hear very often on an otherwise unremarkable Friday night in a quiet subdivision. The silence lasted, by my best guess, almost 2 full minutes. Then, abruptly, I heard the sound retreat. That same wet, dragging quality, moving back down the hallway, faster now, and then nothing at all. Around 90 seconds later, I heard sirens outside, and only then did I unlock the bathroom door and step out into a hallway that was, thankfully, completely empty. The responding officers searched the entire house and the backyard for almost an hour. They found a sliding glass door off the kitchen, the one that led directly out to the pool patio, standing open about 6 inches. I always kept it locked, and I have never, before or since that night, been careless enough to leave it open by accident. The lock itself showed no signs of forced entry, no scratches, nothing broken. It had simply been unlocked and opened, somehow, from a position I couldn't explain. They also checked every window and exterior door in the house before they got to the hallway, methodically working room by room while I sat wrapped in a blanket on the living room couch, unable to stop shaking, even with the AC barely running. Every window was locked. Every other door was locked. Only the kitchen slider had been compromised, and only in that strange, unforced way that made it clear whoever or whatever had come inside hadn't needed to break anything to do it. They also found, this time, something much harder to explain away as a raccoon or a spooked teenager. On the hallway carpet, leading from the kitchen toward the bathroom where I'd locked myself in, there was a trail of damp, irregular marks, Not footprints exactly, nothing with clear toes or a heel, just elongated wet patches, evenly spaced, consistent with something moving low along the ground rather than walking upright the way a person would. The trail stopped precisely at the bathroom door, exactly where I'd heard the silence settle, and there was no trail leading away from it, despite my having clearly heard something retreat back down the hallway only moments before the officers arrived. One of the officers, an older guy who'd clearly seen a lot in his career and didn't seem inclined to dismiss things easily, crouched down and looked at those marks for a long time without saying anything. When I asked him what he thought they were, he said, carefully, that he genuinely didn't know, and that in his experience, it was better to be honest about that than make something up just to make me feel better. I appreciated that more than I could say at the time, even though it meant I spent the rest of that night and many nights after without any comforting explanation to hold on to. Before they left, that same officer asked me, almost as an aside, whether I'd had any other calls to this address or whether I knew if the previous owners had. I told him I didn't know, but that I could try to find out. He said it wasn't urgent, just something he liked to check when a call felt unusual, since a lot of the time these things weren't isolated, even if nobody had ever put the pieces together. I did some digging over the next few days, calling the county records office and eventually tracking down the name of the family who'd owned the house before me, the Delacroix family, who'd sold it after only 2 years of ownership. I found a woman on social media who I was fairly sure was the daughter, now in her 20s, and sent her a careful, vague message asking if she remembered anything unusual about living there. She wrote back within a day, and her response was short, almost clipped, saying only that she didn't like to talk about that house and that she hoped I was doing okay. She didn't respond to anything I asked after that, and I didn't push it. I didn't need to. The fact that she'd answered at all, and the way she'd answered, told me more than a longer message probably would have. I didn't sleep in that house again after that night. I stayed at Kaylee's apartment for the following week while I figured out what to do, going back only during the day, with her or my sister with me, to gather clothes and essentials. During one of those daytime visits, close to 2 weeks after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to drain the pool completely, hiring a service to do it since I couldn't stand the idea of that water sitting there another night, no matter how many chemicals had been run through it since. The technician who came out to drain it found something in the main drain at the bottom of the deep end that he brought to my attention before starting the job, assuming I'd want to know. A substantial tangle of what he described as animal hair, dark and matted, clogging the drain almost completely. He said it wasn't unusual exactly. Pools near wooded or overgrown areas sometimes had wildlife get into them, and this kind of buildup could result. But when I asked him, hesitantly, if it looked like it could be from a raccoon, he paused for a moment, turned the clump over in his gloved hand, and said, in a tone that didn't sound entirely convinced by his own words, that it was probably something like that. Sure. He didn't offer any more detail than that, and I didn't ask him to. I stood well back from the edge the entire time he worked, watching the water level slowly drop, half expecting, with every inch that drained away, to see something down there that I wouldn't be able to unsee. Nothing like that happened. By the time the pool was fully empty, it was just a plain, ordinary concrete basin, cracked slightly along one seam near the drain, stained with the kind of algae discoloration you'd expect from a pool that had gone a few weeks without proper maintenance. It looked, in the flat light of that Tuesday afternoon, almost embarrassingly mundane, nothing at all like the glowing, restless thing I'd stared into from my bedroom window 2 weeks earlier. I remember standing at the edge of that empty pool for a long time after the technician left, feeling a strange, hollow kind of grief for the version of that summer I'd imagined for myself back in May, before any of this started. I asked the real estate company, months later, through my old realtor Pam, whether they intended to fill the pool back in or keep it once they resold the property. Pam said she didn't know for certain, but had heard through the local grapevine that the investment company planned to keep it as a selling point, since pools added resale value in that market regardless of a house's history. I remember feeling almost sick hearing that, imagining some other family moving in, some other kid begging their parents to let them swim right up until dusk, with absolutely no idea what might be waiting at the bottom of that light once the sun went down. The weeks after that night were some of the strangest of my life. Not because anything else happened, but precisely because nothing did. and I had no idea what to do with a fear that had nowhere left to go. I went back to work at the dental office within a few days because I couldn't afford not to. And I remember sitting through entire appointments on autopilot, smiling and making small talk with patients while some part of my mind stayed permanently fixed on that hallway, that silence, that gap of darkness under the bathroom door. Kaylee noticed before I said anything to her directly. She told me later that I'd developed a habit that week of glancing at doorways mid-conversation, like I was checking for something, and that it had scared her almost as much as anything I eventually told her about what happened. I moved out completely by the end of August, selling the house at a loss to a real estate investment company that bought it as is, with no questions asked about why a woman who'd only lived there 3 months was suddenly so eager to unload it. I've heard, secondhand through Kaylee, who still lives in Brandenburg, that the house has changed hands twice more since then, each time after a fairly short period of ownership, though I've never let myself dig into exactly why. Some part of me doesn't want to know if what happened to me happened to them too, and an equally large part of me is terrified it might not have. That for whatever reason, it was specifically me it wanted, and that it might still be out there, patient, waiting to find me again somewhere new. I never went swimming again after that summer, not even in a friend's pool, not even at the community pool near the townhouse I eventually settled into. It sounds like a small thing to lose compared to everything else, but I think about it more than people probably expect. I used to love the water. I grew up doing summer swim league, spent most of my childhood summers with permanently chlorine-bleached hair, and none of that fear had ever touched me before that house. Now I can't even watch a movie with a pool scene in it without my chest tightening, without some small animal part of my brain checking the edges of the screen for a shape that shouldn't be there, floating just beneath the surface, patient, watching, waiting for someone to notice it looking back. I think about that pool light more than I'd like to admit. I think about the shape floating in the water, watching me through the glass without blinking. I think about the sound of something dragging itself down my hallway, and the silence it left behind outside that bathroom door, a silence that felt, even now, less like an absence of sound and more like something choosing, very deliberately, not to make any. The house I live in now doesn't have a pool, and I've told every realtor I've worked with since that it never will. My sister thinks it's just leftover trauma from a bad divorce and a stressful move, and honestly, that's the explanation I let most people believe, because it's so much easier than the truth. But some nights, when I hear my own pipes settle, or the air conditioning kick on with a low hum that sounds, for just a half second, almost like humming, I find myself lying perfectly still in the dark, listening the same way I did that July night, waiting to hear whether something is moving down the hall toward my door. About a year after I moved out, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the county's public flood and drainage records for that stretch of retention land behind the old house, mostly just to understand what Gary Thornbury had been gesturing at that day over his fence without quite saying it outright. What I found wasn't dramatic. No old newspaper stories about disappearances, no local legend with a name attached to it that I could dig up. Just a pattern, if you looked at it the right way. A handful of animal control complaints going back almost 15 years, all from houses backing onto that same drainage area, all describing something similar to what I'd experienced, usually late at night, usually during the hottest, wettest stretch of summer, and every single report eventually closed out with no findings and no further action. Nothing connected them officially. Nothing ever would, probably, since none of it rose to the level anyone in an official capacity was willing to take seriously. But reading through them, one after another, in a dim library archive room on a Tuesday afternoon, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not quite relief, since none of it made the fear go away, but a strange, cold comfort in knowing it hadn't only been me. That whatever moved through that retention land didn't care whose pool it was or whose fence it circled. It had been doing this for a long time, long before I ever bought that house, and it would very likely keep doing it long after I was nothing but one more unresolved complaint in a folder nobody looked at anymore. Sometimes, when I let myself think about it honestly, instead of pushing it away, I try to imagine what it actually wanted from me that summer. Not food, not money, not anything a normal intruder would want. It never took a single thing from that house, never damaged anything beyond the unlocked door it never should have been able to open. All it ever did, as far as I can tell, was watch and wait, and occasionally get close enough to make sure I knew it could. I've never found a satisfying answer to what that means, and I'm not sure I want one. Some questions, I've decided, are better left exactly where they are, sitting quietly at the bottom of a pool that isn't mine anymore, in a backyard I'll never see again. It never has followed me here, not that I've been able to tell. But I keep the hallway light on anyway, every single night, and I don't plan on stopping anytime soon. Story number 3. I've told pieces of this story to a few people over the years, usually after a couple of drinks, usually stopping myself before I get to the end because the end is the part nobody ever believes, even though it's the part I have the most actual proof of. My husband Jason still won't talk about it at all if he can avoid it. I don't blame him. I think about it constantly anyway, so I might as well finally get the whole thing down somewhere. We bought our house in the summer of 2021 in a small subdivision called Maple Hollow just outside Knoxville, Tennessee. It was a newer build compared to most of what we'd looked at, finished only about 11 years earlier, which for our budget felt like a rare find, since older houses in our price range usually came with a laundry list of problems we couldn't afford to fix. 4 bedrooms, an attached 2-car garage, and a backyard that backed up to a shared greenbelt the HOA maintained. A strip of trees and walking trails that ran behind about a dozen houses on our side of the street before opening up into a small community park. The house also had a large screened-in back porch, and beneath it, accessible through a low hatch door near the foundation, a crawl space that ran the full length of the house. Standard for the area, the inspector told us, since the water table in that part of Tennessee was too high for basements to be practical in most new construction. I remember him mentioning, almost as a footnote during the walkthrough, that the crawlspace access hatch didn't have a lock on it, just a simple latch, and recommending we add one eventually to keep animals out. It seemed like such a minor detail at the time that I don't think either of us gave it a second thought. The inspection itself took most of that Saturday morning, and I remember trailing behind the inspector through most of it, more out of excitement than any real concern, snapping photos on my phone of every room like a tourist in my own future home. When he got to the crawlspace hatch, he only spent a few minutes actually inside, poking his flashlight around and calling out measurements to his assistant rather than climbing in fully himself, which struck me at the time as fairly typical for that kind of inspection. Looking back, I've wondered more than once whether a more thorough look that day might have caught something, some sign of prior use, some hint of the space's actual history. Though I've also come to accept that whatever had or hadn't been down there in that particular season likely wouldn't have been obvious to anyone without reason to look closely. We moved in at the end of June, and just like every story like this seems to start, the first month was wonderful. We were newly married. This was our first house together, and we spent almost every evening out on that screened porch, grilling, drinking wine, watching the fireflies come up out of the grass at dusk. Jason worked in software and could do a lot of his job remotely that summer, so some days he'd even take his laptop out there in the mornings before it got too hot, working with the porch door open and the sound of birds in the trees behind the yard. Our next-door neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Carol Ann Pruitt, who'd lived in Maple Hollow since it was first developed, brought over a plate of banana bread the week we moved in and stayed to chat on the porch for almost an hour, telling us about the neighborhood, the HOA rules, which restaurants in town were worth the drive. She mentioned, almost in passing, that our house had actually been one of the original builds in the subdivision, one of the first 5 or 6 homes finished when the development went up back in the early 2000s, and that it had changed hands a handful of times over the years. When I asked, out of simple curiosity, what had happened to the original family, she got a strange, distant look on her face for just a second before saying she didn't really remember, that it had been a long time ago and people moved for all sorts of reasons. I didn't press it. There was no reason to, at the time. The first odd thing happened in the middle of July, and at the time, neither of us thought it was odd at all. Jason mentioned that our porch light, a simple fixture mounted above the door leading out from the kitchen, had started flickering intermittently, sometimes staying dim for a few seconds before coming back to full brightness. We assumed it was a wiring issue, common enough in houses that had sat empty for a stretch before we bought them, and I called an electrician to take a look. He checked the wiring, found nothing wrong that he could identify, replaced the bulb just in case, and told us to call back if it kept happening. It didn't happen again for almost 2 weeks, so we let it go. Looking back, I've wondered whether that flickering had a much simpler explanation than faulty wiring. Whether it coincided with someone down in the crawl space running a small appliance or light source off a rigged connection to our own electrical system, drawing enough power in brief bursts to cause exactly that kind of intermittent dimming. Nobody was ever able to confirm this for certain, since the crawl space's dugout section didn't show clear evidence of an illegal electrical tap by the time investigators searched it thoroughly. But the timing always struck me as too coincidental to fully dismiss, especially once we understood everything else that had been happening just a few feet beneath our kitchen floor during those same weeks. Around the same time, I started noticing something small but persistent. Things in the kitchen were very slightly out of place in the mornings. Not dramatically. A cabinet door left an inch open that I was certain I'd closed the night before. A chair pushed in at a slightly different angle than I remembered leaving it. The kind of thing that's easy to dismiss as your own forgetfulness, especially in a new house where you're still learning your own habits. I mentioned it to Jason a few times, and he mostly just shrugged it off, half joking that I was clearly sleepwalking and doing some late-night tidying I had no memory of. I laughed about it too, at the time. It genuinely seemed like the most reasonable explanation. There was one particular morning, in the last week of July, when I found the pantry door standing wide open and a box of crackers sitting slightly askew on the counter, the plastic liner inside torn open in a way that looked almost deliberate rather than accidental. I remember standing there in my robe, coffee half made, staring at that box and trying to piece together some version of events where I'd done this myself the night before without remembering, half asleep and reaching for a snack. I told myself that's exactly what had happened, because the alternative explanation wasn't one I was ready to consider yet, not with everything still feeling so new and unexplainable. The first thing that actually unsettled me happened at the very end of July. I woke up around 4 a.m. needing water, and as I passed through the kitchen on my way back to bed, I noticed the crawlspace hatch door, visible through the back porch's screen from a certain angle in the kitchen window, was standing very slightly ajar. I remember standing there in the dark, staring at it, telling myself that the latch had probably just come loose on its own, maybe from wind or settling. I didn't go check it that night. I went back to bed and didn't sleep well for the rest of it. Standing at that window, I noticed something else too. Something I didn't mention to Jason until much later because I genuinely wasn't sure I hadn't imagined it. A faint, sour smell drifting up through the kitchen. Something between damp earth and something less easily placed, gone almost as quickly as I noticed it. I told myself it was just the crawl space itself, exposed briefly to the warm night air through that open hatch, carrying up the ordinary smell of dirt and moisture that any exposed foundation space would have. I've since learned from Detective Alvarez that this kind of smell is exactly what you'd expect from a space that had been lived in, however minimally, for extended stretches of time. And I think some quiet, unacknowledged part of me understood that distinction even then, standing barefoot in my dark kitchen at 4 in the morning, though I wasn't ready to let myself think it through to its actual conclusion. The next morning, I told Jason about it, and we went out together to check the hatch in daylight. It was closed when we got out there. Either it had swung shut on its own sometime after I saw it, or, a possibility neither of us said out loud, someone had closed it before we came to look. Jason opened it and looked inside with a flashlight, said everything looked normal as far as he could tell. Dirt floor, some old scraps of plastic sheeting left behind by the builders, ductwork running along the joists above. He added a small padlock to the latch that afternoon, and we both felt better having done something concrete about it, even though neither of us fully believed a loose latch explained the ajar door I'd seen at 4 in the morning. Jason, in particular, seemed to take the whole incident harder than I initially realized. He'd grown up in a house with a similar crawl space back in Ohio and mentioned to me a few days later, almost sheepishly, that he'd had a recurring nightmare as a kid about something living beneath his childhood bedroom floor, a fear he said he hadn't thought about in probably 15 years until that morning we found the hatch standing open. He laughed it off when he told me, calling it a silly, embarrassing thing to admit as a grown man. But I noticed after that he started checking the padlock himself most nights before bed. A small ritual neither of us discussed directly, but that both of us clearly found some measure of comfort in. For about 2 weeks after that, things were quiet. The porch lights stopped flickering. The kitchen stayed exactly as we'd left it each night. I started to relax, mostly convincing myself that everything strange that had happened so far had a mundane explanation I just hadn't landed on yet. Old wiring, an unfamiliar house settling into a new season, my own tired mind playing small tricks on itself in the dark. During that quiet stretch, I ran into Carol Ann again while walking our new puppy, a rescue mutt named Biscuit we'd brought home only a few weeks earlier, and mentioned, half joking, that we'd had a scare with the crawlspace hatch being open one night. Her reaction surprised me. She went quiet for a long moment, glanced almost involuntarily toward our house, and then asked, carefully, whether we'd had any other odd things happen since moving in. When I told her about the flickering light in the kitchen cabinets, she got a look on her face I couldn't quite place at the time, something between concern and a kind of re-signed recognition, like she'd heard some version of this before. She said, eventually, that the family two owners before us, not the original family, but the ones after them, had mentioned something similar shortly before they sold, though she couldn't remember the specifics anymore, only that they'd left sooner than anyone expected and hadn't said much about why. She told me not to worry about it too much, that old houses had their quirks, and changed the subject to asking about Biscuit's training. I let her redirect the conversation, though something about the exchange sat uneasily with me for the rest of that walk. Then, in the second week of August, everything started again, and this time it escalated fast enough that we couldn't explain it away. It started with sounds. Not every night, but often enough that we both started noticing a pattern. A low, irregular thumping from somewhere beneath the house, usually between midnight and 2 a.m., sometimes just once or twice, sometimes going on steadily for 10 or 15 minutes before stopping. Jason initially assumed it was the HVAC system, or maybe a plumbing issue, something structural rather than anything more concerning. We had a home warranty company send someone out to check the crawl space and the mechanical systems down there, and the technician found nothing wrong. No loose ductwork, no plumbing issues, nothing that would explain the sound we described. He did mention, almost as an aside while packing up his tools, that it was a big crawl space for a house that size, bigger than he usually saw in newer construction, running the full footprint of the house and then some with a section toward the back that seemed to extend slightly beyond the exterior wall line in a way he found a little unusual, though not alarming enough to flag as a real problem. I didn't think much of that comment at the time. I wish now that I'd asked him to explain exactly what he meant by extend beyond the wall line, because it would come back to matter enormously. The thumping continued, on and off, through the rest of August. We started sleeping worse. Both of us, snapping at each other over small things in a way that wasn't like either of us. The particular exhaustion of two people quietly convinced something was wrong, but unable to prove it to anyone, including sometimes each other. I remember Jason getting frustrated one night, close to 1 a.m., and going out to the crawlspace hatch with a flashlight and a hammer, determined to find whatever was causing the noise. He unlocked the padlock, opened the hatch, and crouched there for several minutes, shining the light around before coming back inside, telling me he hadn't seen anything at all. No animal, no obvious cause, just the same dirt floor and ductwork as before. He said the thumping had stopped completely the moment he opened the hatch, and didn't start again for the rest of that night. I remember standing at the kitchen window that particular night, watching him crouched at the hatch with the flashlight, feeling an unease I couldn't fully explain even to myself, a strong, instinctive urge to call him back inside that I mostly attributed at the time to ordinary nerves about him poking around in a dark, cramped space alone at 1 a.m. Looking back, knowing everything I know now about what that space actually contained, I think about how close he came that night to crawling in far enough to find that dugout section himself, alone, in the dark, with no one else aware of where he was. I've never been able to shake the thought of what might have happened if Thomas had been down there at that exact moment, cornered in a space he'd clearly come to think of as entirely his own. That pattern held for the next several nights. The thumping would happen, sometimes for quite a while, but the instant anyone opened that hatch to check, it would go completely silent, every single time, as if. Whatever was causing it knew the exact moment it was being observed. Around this same time, we noticed something else that, on its own, seemed almost too small to mention, but that took on real weight once we understood what was actually happening beneath us. Our monthly water bill, which had been fairly consistent our first 2 months in the house, jumped noticeably in late August, enough that I called the utility company, assuming a meter error. The representative I spoke with checked the account and said the meter readings looked accurate and consistent with normal usage patterns for a house our size, which only confused me more, since neither Jason nor I could account for the increase ourselves. We had a plumber come out to check for leaks, and he found nothing. No dripping fixtures, no running toilets, nothing that would explain where the extra water was going. It wasn't until much later, after everything came out, that I understood exactly where some of that water had likely been going, and the thought of it still makes my skin crawl in a way that's hard to fully articulate. By early September, we'd installed 2 motion-activated cameras, one aimed at the crawlspace hatch itself from the porch, and one covering the general backyard toward the greenbelt, in case whatever was going on had more to do with something moving around outside than anything actually underneath the house. For almost a week, the cameras caught nothing beyond the occasional rabbit or the neighbor's cat cutting through our yard. We started, cautiously, to relax again. Then, on the night of September 9th, the crawlspace camera caught something that changed everything. At 1:14 a.m., the footage showed the hatch door slowly swinging open from the inside. Not forced, not kicked. Swung open the way a door opens when someone on the other side of it turns the latch and pushes, slow and deliberate. A hand emerged first, pale in the infrared footage, followed by an arm, and then, over the course of almost a full minute, a person pulling themselves out from beneath our house and standing up on the grass just outside the porch, brushing dirt from their clothes with an unhurried, almost casual motion, like someone stepping out of their own basement rather than crawling out from underneath someone else's home in the middle of the night. The figure stood there for close to 2 minutes, facing the house, before walking calmly across the backyard toward the greenbelt and disappearing into the tree line. Neither of us had woken up when it happened. We only saw it the next morning when I checked the camera app over coffee, and I remember the specific, sick lurch in my stomach watching that footage for the first time, replaying it 3 or 4 times before I could make myself call Jason over to look at it too. He watched it in complete silence, standing behind me with his hand gripping the back of my chair hard enough that his knuckles went pale, and when it finished, he just said, quietly, "We're calling the police right now," in a tone I'd never heard from him before, flat and controlled in a way that scared me almost as much as the footage itself. We called the police the next morning and showed them the footage. They took it seriously in a way the earlier reports about noise and flickering lights hadn't been, and a detective came out personally that afternoon to look at the crawlspace hatch with us. 2 patrol officers arrived first, walking the perimeter of the house and the immediate edge of the greenbelt while we waited inside with the doors locked, Biscuit pacing anxiously at our feet, clearly picking up on our own nerves, even without understanding why. When Detective Alvarez arrived about 20 minutes later, she watched the footage on my phone twice through, asked several pointed questions about the crawlspace hatch and how long the padlock had been in place, and then asked if she could take a look at the space herself with proper equipment before anyone else went near it. What they found inside, once they actually searched the crawlspace properly with proper lighting instead of a handheld flashlight, is the part of this story that I still have trouble fully believing, even though I was standing right there when they found it. Detective Alvarez and one of the patrol officers went in first, both of them wearing coveralls over their uniforms and carrying heavy flashlights, while Jason and I waited on the back porch, close enough to hear their voices but not able to make out most of what they were saying to each other beneath us. It felt like they were down there for a very long time, though it was probably closer to 15 minutes, before Alvarez climbed back out, pulled off her gloves, and asked if we could sit down with her for a minute before she explained what they'd found. Toward the back of the crawlspace, in the section the home warranty technician had vaguely described weeks earlier as extending slightly beyond the exterior wall line, there was a section that had clearly been dug out and expanded well beyond what the original foundation plans would have included. A low, cramped space, maybe 6 feet by 10, tall enough for someone to sit up in but not stand, with the dirt walls reinforced crudely with scrap plywood that looked, from the weathering on it, like it had been there for years rather than weeks. Inside that space, officers found a sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, several empty water jugs, and, more disturbing than any of that, a small collection of photographs tucked into a plastic sleeve to protect them from the damp. Alvarez showed us a few of the photographs later that week, once they'd been processed as evidence, though she was careful about which ones she let us see and for how long, clearly trying to protect us from the full weight of what had been documented down there. The photographs were of our house, not just the exterior. Pictures taken through windows, at different times of day, across what looked like months, showing Jason and me in the kitchen, on the back porch, in the living room, going about ordinary evenings with absolutely no idea we were being watched and documented from a space directly beneath our own feet. Some of the photos were older than our time in the house entirely, showing a different family in the same rooms, a couple with 2 young kids I didn't recognize at all, clearly taken years before we'd ever bought the property. I remember sitting on our porch steps that afternoon, going through the small stack of photos Alvarez allowed us to see, feeling a specific, dizzying kind of violation that I don't think I've ever fully recovered from. There was one photo in particular, taken through our bedroom window on what looked like an ordinary Tuesday evening based on the clothes I was wearing, that I recognized immediately. I remembered that exact evening, folding laundry while half watching a show on my laptop, having absolutely no sense at all that I was being observed from somewhere below the very floor I was sitting on. Knowing now that this had happened dozens, maybe hundreds of times, across nearly a decade and multiple families, made something in my chest tighten in a way I still haven't fully shaken even now, more than a year later. This is where the story stops being simply about noise and shadows and becomes something else entirely, something that still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it in detail. The detective working the case, a calm, methodical woman named Detective Alvarez, spent the better part of 2 weeks piecing together who exactly had been living beneath our house, and what she eventually found upended everything we thought we understood about the situation, including who, or what, we'd actually been dealing with the entire time. Alvarez came back to update us in person about 10 days after that first search, sitting with us at our own kitchen table with a folder of printed records and old news clippings she'd pulled together, walking us through what she'd found with the careful, deliberate pacing of someone who'd clearly rehearsed how to deliver this kind of news without causing more harm than necessary. I remember Jason gripping my hand under the table hard enough to hurt while she talked, both of us braced for something we couldn't have properly imagined even with everything we'd already seen. The man they eventually identified, through a partial print lifted from one of the water jugs and cross-referenced against county records, was named Thomas Whitlock. And Thomas Whitlock, according to those same county records, had been the teenage son of the family who originally had the house built, back when Maple Hollow was first developed. According to a local news archive Alvarez pulled during her investigation, Thomas had gone missing from that very house at 17 years old in the spring of 2011, just months after the family moved in. The case had been treated at the time as a runaway. A troubled teenager, according to a few brief mentions in the old reporting, who'd had a difficult relationship with his stepfather and had simply left one night and never come back. His mother had reported him missing, search efforts had turned up nothing, and eventually, as happens with a lot of runaway cases that never resolve, it had quietly faded from the news and, presumably, from most people's memory of the neighborhood entirely. Alvarez showed us a photocopy of the original missing person flyer from 2011, a grainy yearbook-style photo of a thin, dark-haired teenager with a guarded, unsmiling expression, and something about seeing that photo made the whole thing feel suddenly, sickeningly real in a way the crawl space itself somehow hadn't quite managed to. This wasn't some anonymous drifter who'd stumbled onto our property. This was a kid who had once slept in what was probably my own bedroom, eaten dinner in what was now our kitchen, and who had, for reasons no one fully understood, chosen, or been driven, to retreat beneath the floorboards of his own childhood home rather than ever truly leaving it. Except he hadn't run away at all, or if he hadn't gone far. I asked Alvarez during that same conversation whether Carol Ann next door would have known any of this, given how long she'd lived in the neighborhood, and Alvarez said that during her canvass of the street, several longtime residents had, in fact, remembered pieces of the original disappearance, though most described it exactly the way Carol Ann had to me. Vague, distant, something from a long time ago that people preferred not to dwell on. She said this kind of collective, half-conscious forgetting wasn't unusual in cases like this, especially when a community never got real closure, never got a body or an arrest or any kind of definitive answer to hold on to. It was easier, she said, for people to simply let the details blur over time than to keep actively wondering what had really happened to a boy who'd vanished from a house that still had a family living in it, going about their ordinary lives, year after year. Detective Alvarez told us, in a conversation that still gives me chills to remember clearly, that based on what they found in that expanded section of the crawl space, layers of it, older debris beneath newer debris, evidence of the space having been lived in and reinforced gradually over what looked like years rather than months, it appeared Thomas Whitlock had never actually left the property at all. At some point after his disappearance was reported, he had, for reasons no one has ever been able to fully explain, retreated into the crawl space beneath his own family's house and simply never left it. Through multiple owners. Through multiple families, including the one whose photographs we'd found alongside our own, and now including us. 10 years, living in the dark beneath the very floors of strangers, occasionally emerging at night to move through the house he'd once belonged to, watching families raise children and grow older, and eventually move away in rooms he must have known better than any of them ever would. I asked Alvarez, when she told us this, how something like that was even possible. How a person could live undetected beneath an occupied house for a decade without ever being caught, without anyone noticing food disappearing, without any of the multiple previous owners ever finding what we'd found. She said, carefully, that it likely hadn't been constant the whole time, that there were almost certainly stretches where he'd left for weeks or months at a time, maybe surviving elsewhere, maybe even attempting some kind of normal life before something drew him back. She said the expanded crawl space showed signs of at least 2, possibly 3 distinct periods of heavier use, separated by stretches where it looked like it had simply been sealed and left alone. Whatever had happened to Thomas Whitlock at 17, whatever had made him retreat beneath his own house instead of simply leaving it behind entirely, it had apparently never fully released its hold on him, pulling him back again and again to the same 6x10 patch of dirt under the same porch, regardless of who was living in the rooms above. They found him 3 days later, not far from the neighborhood, sleeping in an abandoned utility shed near the community park at the far end of the Greenbelt Trail, the same trail that connected directly to our backyard. He didn't resist when officers approached him. According to Alvarez, he barely spoke at all during the initial encounter, and what little he did say didn't amount to any kind of coherent explanation for the 10 years he'd spent moving in and out of that crawl space. He's currently receiving psychiatric evaluation and treatment rather than facing serious criminal charges, since nothing was ever taken from any of the homes he stayed beneath, and no one was ever physically harmed, at least as far as anyone has been able to determine. I still don't know how to feel about that outcome, even now. Some days I feel a kind of grief for him that surprises me, imagining 17 years old and whatever pain drove him underground instead of away. Other days, mostly late at night, all I can think about is those photographs. Years of them, of us, of the family before us, taken through the glass of windows we'd always assumed kept us private inside our own home. Alvarez told us, in one of our last real conversations before the case moved fully into the court system, that investigators had eventually found something else in the crawl space they hadn't shared with us right away, wanting to be sure of what they were looking at before saying anything. Buried near the back wall of the dugout space, wrapped carefully in what looked like an old bedsheet, they'd found a small collection of childhood belongings. A stuffed animal, a handful of toy cars, a couple of children's books, all of it clearly decades old and clearly not belonging to Thomas himself, given the apparent age of the items relative to when he would have been a teenager. Alvarez said the working theory, based on interviews conducted with Thomas's surviving relatives, was that these had belonged to him as a much younger child, kept and moved down into that space at some point, a fragment of the life he'd had before whatever happened to him at 17 that none of us would likely ever fully understand. She said it in a careful, measured tone, clearly trying not to speculate further than the evidence allowed, but I remember the way her voice caught slightly on that detail, like even someone who'd worked cases like this for years still found something uniquely unsettling about it. We moved out within a month of all of this being resolved, obviously. We sold the house at a significant loss, since by the time it went back on the market, most of the neighborhood already knew exactly why, and no amount of staging photos could undo what everyone on that street understood had been living beneath one of their homes for the better part of a decade. I've heard, through a neighbor we're still loosely in touch with, that the new owners had the entire crawl space excavated and re-poured as a proper conditioned basement before moving in, which I understand completely, even if I sometimes wonder whether that kind of change can ever really undo what a space like that has held inside it for so long. Jason and I live in a condo now, a mid-rise building downtown with no yard, no crawl space, nothing beneath us but a parking garage and the foundations of the building itself. I used to think I'd miss having a yard again someday, the way I did when we first started house hunting after we got married. I don't think about it that way anymore. Some nights, lying awake in a building with dozens of other units stacked above and below and beside ours, I find myself oddly grateful for exactly that. For knowing, with total certainty, that there's no dirt floor beneath me where anyone could quietly build a life without my ever noticing, watching me through the glass of my own kitchen window from a space I never even knew existed. We saw a couples counselor for a few months after we moved, not because our relationship had fractured exactly, but because we both needed somewhere to put everything we were carrying that didn't involve constantly rehashing it with each other at midnight. She helped me understand something I hadn't been able to name on my own. That a lot of my lingering fear wasn't really about Thomas Whitlock specifically anymore, but about the broader, harder truth the whole situation had forced on me, that you can live inside a space, love it, fill it with your own routines and rituals and quiet evenings, and still never fully know everything it contains. That certainty, the kind I used to take completely for granted about my own home, was the thing I think I actually lost that September, more than any sense of physical safety. It's taken a long time and a lot of deliberately mundane, unremarkable nights in our new place to start rebuilding even a fraction of that back. I think about those photographs constantly, still. Not just the ones of Jason and me, though those are the ones that keep me up most nights. I think about the family before us, the one with the 2 kids, whose faces I never got the chance to properly see beyond a few blurry, distant shots the detective allowed me a brief look at during the investigation. I've wondered, more than once, whether they ever noticed anything strange during their years in that house. A flickering light, a cabinet door left slightly open, a low thumping sound beneath their feet in the middle of the night that they explained away, the same way we did, as nothing more than an old house settling, or their own tired minds playing tricks in the dark. I've thought, too, about trying to track that family down somehow, just to ask them directly, but every time I get close to actually doing it, I stop myself. Part of it is respecting whatever peace they may have already made with their years in that house, assuming they never found out what we eventually did. But a bigger part of it, if I'm honest, is that I'm not sure I could handle hearing the answer either way. If they say no, nothing strange ever happened, it would mean Thomas simply hadn't been active during their years there, which raises its own uncomfortable question of what, exactly, made him choose to resurface again once we moved in. And if they say yes, that they noticed things too and simply never followed up on it the way we eventually did, I think that might be even harder to sit with, knowing how easily this could have gone on for years longer than it already had, undiscovered, if we'd made slightly different choices about which small, strange details were worth taking seriously. I hope, for their sake, that they never found out the truth the way we eventually did. And some small, uncomfortable part of me hopes just as much that they never will. Story number 4. I've told this story out loud exactly twice. Once to a police detective in a cold interview room, and once to my mother over the phone, both times in a voice that didn't sound entirely like my own. Writing it down feels different, slower, like I finally have the room to say all of it, instead of just the parts that fit into a police report or a mother's need for reassurance. So I'm going to tell it the way it actually happened, in order, even the parts that still make my hands shake a little when I type them. My name is Sarah Whitman. I was 28 that fall, working night shifts as a nurse at a hospital outside Nashville, which meant my entire social life had shrunk down to a handful of coworkers, a group text with 2 college friends who'd both moved away years earlier, and my roommate, Amanda Carter, who I'd known since nursing school and who worked days at the same hospital, which meant we mostly saw each other in the 15-minute overlap of a shift change. Amanda was the one who got me on the app, the same way these stories always seem to start, and I don't say that as a criticism of her. She meant well. She'd had decent luck with it herself, and she was tired of watching me come home from 12-hour shifts to an empty apartment and immediately fall asleep on the couch with the TV still on. You need something in your life that isn't work, she told me one morning over coffee, already half out the door for her shift. Just look. You don't have to do anything with it, I looked. 3 days later, I matched with a man named Jason Bennett. His profile felt different from the others in a way I noticed immediately. Not slicker, exactly, just more specific. A photo of him at what looked like a family lake house, squinting into the sun with a fishing rod in one hand. A photo in scrubs, captioned, "Yes, those are real. No, I will not diagnose your rash over text." A photo of him and an older woman I assumed was his mother, both of them laughing at something. His bio said he was a physical therapist, 30 years old, originally from a small town in Kentucky, in Nashville for work. It ended with, "Looking for someone who won't get weird about my job when I ask to see your knees on the first date." I'm kidding. Mostly. I laughed out loud in my kitchen reading that. I matched with him immediately, and he messaged first. Something easy about the Scrubs picture, and within an hour we'd fallen into the kind of rhythm you don't often get with a stranger. Quick, funny, a little flirty, both of us clearly enjoying it rather than performing enjoyment for each other. It helped that we had the medical field in common. We spent that first week comparing notes on difficult patients, terrible coworkers, the specific exhaustion of a 12-hour shift on your feet, and it felt less like dating and more like finding someone who already understood a language most people didn't speak. Amanda teased me relentlessly about how much I was smiling at my phone that week, and I let her, because it was true and I didn't care. There was a particular night, maybe 5 days in, that I still think about now with a kind of retroactive unease I didn't feel at the time. I'd had a rough shift. A patient coding twice before we finally stabilized him. The kind of night that leaves you hollowed out and shaky even hours after you clock out. And I texted Jason mostly out of habit, not expecting much beyond a sympathetic emoji. Instead, he called me at 11 at night and stayed on the phone with me for almost 2 hours while I cried a little and talked through what had happened. And he didn't try to fix it or rush me past it, just listened, asked good questions, told me a story of his own about a physical therapy patient he'd lost years earlier that he said he still thought about sometimes. It was, at the time, the single most comforting conversation I'd had with anyone in longer than I wanted to admit. Looking back, though, I've turned that phone call over more than almost any other memory from those first weeks, because of how naturally he slipped into exactly the right tone for a stranger to hit on a first real conversation about death. Not rehearsed, not performed, but so precisely calibrated to what I needed in that moment that it's hard now not to wonder how much practice it had actually taken to get that good at it. We met in person after about 10 days at a diner near my apartment that stayed open late enough to work around both our schedules. He looked like his photos, which after 2 friends' warnings about catfishing felt like a genuine relief, and he was, if anything, more charming in person. Quick with a joke, easy to talk to, the kind of attentive that made you feel like the only person in the room. We talked for almost 3 hours, closing the diner down, and when he walked me to my car, he didn't try to kiss me, just squeezed my hand and said he hoped this wasn't the last time. And I remember thinking, driving home, that I hadn't felt this specific, uncomplicated kind of hopeful in a very long time. The next month went the way good things go when you're not yet looking for the cracks in them. We saw each other 2 or 3 times a week, working around both our schedules, texting through the dead hours of overnight shifts when neither of us could sleep. He told me, gradually, about his family. A mother, Linda, still in Kentucky, and a brother, Chris, who he mentioned only briefly and always with a strange, clipped tone that made it clear, without him saying so directly, that there was history there he wasn't ready to get into. "We don't really talk," he told me once, when I asked, lying on his couch with my head in his lap, half paying attention to whatever was playing on TV. "It's complicated. Twin stuff." I didn't push. I figured, the way you do, that I'd learn more eventually, that some things take time to hand over, and I was more interested, honestly, in the fact that he was a twin at all. I'd never known one before, and I asked him a handful of harmless questions about it, whether they dressed alike as kids, whether people still mixed them up, and he answered most of them lightly enough, though something in. His face tightened slightly every time the conversation lingered there too long. The first thing that unsettled me happened about 5 weeks in, and it was small enough that I almost didn't mention it to anyone. I was at the grocery store near my apartment, the kind of ordinary Tuesday errand that doesn't usually stay in your memory, when a woman near the deli counter did a visible double take at me, then walked over, apologizing before she'd even fully arrived. "I'm so sorry," she said. "This is going to sound so strange, but are you dating Jason Bennett?" I said yes, cautiously, and she laughed, relieved, and introduced herself as Melissa, said she used to cut Jason's hair at a salon downtown, hadn't seen him in probably a year, and that I looked exactly like the kind of woman he always went for. I laughed it off, said something polite, and we parted ways, and I didn't think much of it beyond a small, warm little validation. Proof that he was a real, known person with an actual life in this city, not some elaborate fiction. It was only a few days later, telling Amanda about the encounter over coffee, that she asked a question that snagged in a way I hadn't expected. "Wait," she said. "Did she say Jason used to get his hair cut there, or that a Jason used to?" I didn't remember precisely. It felt like a strange thing to interrogate over something so small, and I told her as much, and she let it go, though I noticed she didn't fully let it go, the way I'd come to recognize Amanda doing when something bothered her more than she wanted to admit out loud. The second thing happened about 2 weeks after that, and this one I couldn't laugh off quite as easily. I'd started spending nights at Jason's apartment fairly regularly by then, and one evening, while he was in the shower, I noticed his phone light up on the nightstand with a text preview, the kind of thing you're not supposed to look at, but that catches your eye anyway before you can stop it. The name on the screen was Mom, and the preview read, "Please stop doing this. He would not want this. Call me back." I told myself it was nothing. A mother's ordinary worry about an adult son, maybe something about Chris, the estranged twin, maybe some old family conflict that had nothing to do with me at all. When Jason came out of the shower, I didn't mention it, and the conversation moved easily into something else, and I let the moment slide into the general, forgivable static of not knowing everything about someone you've only been dating for 7 weeks. I want to be honest that even after that, even after the strange text and Melissa's slightly too warm recognition at the grocery store, I wasn't looking for anything wrong. I was happy. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who ask why I didn't see it sooner. Not that I missed the signs entirely, but that happiness has its own kind of gravity. And I was so relieved to finally feel it again after years of 12-hour shifts and an empty apartment that I let each small strange thing get pulled into orbit around it instead of standing on its own. There was one more thing, smaller than the others, that I only remembered clearly much later, turning the whole timeline back over in my head the way you do after everything falls apart. About a month in, Jason had taken me to a barbecue place his co-workers apparently swore by, a little out-of-the-way spot on the edge of town, and partway through dinner an older man at the next table had stopped by ours, clapped Jason on the shoulder, and said, warmly, "Good to see you back around. Man, it's been a while." Jason had smiled, said something vague and friendly back, and the man had moved on, and I hadn't thought anything of it. Co-workers run into each other. That's what co-workers do. It was only months later, lying awake, replaying every scrap of that relationship, that I remembered the exact phrase the man had used. Back around. Not good to see you, the way you'd greet someone you saw every week. Back around, the way you'd greet someone who'd been gone a long time, and had only recently, cautiously, started reappearing in a life he used to belong to. I also think now about how careful he was, in a way I mistook for simple modesty, about photos. I have almost nothing from those 7 weeks beyond a couple of blurry candids I took myself without asking. No posed pictures together, no photos he'd taken of himself and sent me, even when I asked, half joking, why he never sent selfies the way most guys did. He always had an answer ready, self-deprecating, something about not photographing well, and I always let it go, charmed rather than suspicious, because everything else about him felt so present, so real, so entirely there in the room with me, that the absence of photographic evidence never once registered as an absence of anything at all. The third thing is the one that finally broke that orbit apart completely, and it happened on a night I wasn't even supposed to be at his apartment. I'd had a shift canceled unexpectedly, a scheduling mix-up that gave me an unplanned evening free, and I decided to surprise him, using the spare key he'd given me a few weeks earlier. He wasn't home when I let myself in. Working late, I assumed, since he sometimes picked up evening sessions with patients who couldn't make daytime appointments. I made myself comfortable on his couch, scrolling my phone, and after about 20 minutes, out of nothing but idle boredom, I opened his laptop, which he'd left on the coffee table, still logged into his email. I want to say clearly that I know this was a violation, the same way I knew it the last time I told a story like this one, and I've made my peace with the fact that I did it anyway, because what I found changed the entire shape of what came after. There was an email thread, several messages deep, between Jason's account and an address that belonged, according to the signature at the bottom of each message, to a grief counselor. The most recent message, from 3 days earlier, read, "Chris, I understand this is difficult, but continuing to use your brother's accounts and identity isn't a healthy way to process what happened. I'd strongly encourage you to come back in for another session before this goes further." I sat very still on that couch for a long time after reading it, the laptop glowing in my lap, the apartment silent around me in a way it had never felt silent before. Jason wasn't Jason. He was Chris. And somewhere in that email, buried in a sentence I read 4 or 5 times trying to make it mean something else, was the word brother, present tense in one clause and unmistakably, chillingly past tense in the next. Using your brother's accounts, using what happened, as though the two of them weren't simply estranged the way he'd told me, as though something much worse than a falling out had actually occurred. I heard his key in the door before I'd fully processed any of it, and I didn't have time to close the laptop or compose my face into anything convincing. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me, and something in his expression shifted immediately, some careful mask dropping the same way I'd later come to recognize as a pattern in stories like mine, though at the time I only knew that the man standing in front of me suddenly looked like a stranger wearing a face I'd spent 7 weeks falling for. "I can explain," he said, which is, I've learned what they all say, in this specific order, in this specific tone, as though the explanation has been sitting ready in their mouth the entire time, waiting for the moment it would finally be needed. He told me, sitting across from me at his own kitchen table, that his name was Christopher Bennett, that he was, in fact, a twin, but that the twin, the real Jason, the one in the fishing photo, the one in the scrubs, the one whose mother had raised them both in that small town in Kentucky, had died 2 years earlier. A car accident, he said, late at night, a patch of ice on a back road none of them had driven often enough to know was dangerous. He said that afterward, he hadn't known how to be a person anymore, that everyone in his life had expected him to grieve in a specific, forward-moving way, and that some broken, desperate part of him had started, almost by accident at first, logging into his brother's old accounts just to look at them, to feel close to something that still felt alive in pixels even after it had stopped being alive, everywhere else. He said the dating profile had started the same way. An accident, almost scrolling through his brother's old messages one night and finding himself, before he'd fully decided to. Swiping through the app under his brother's name, his brother's photos, telling himself it was harmless, a strange kind of tribute, a way of letting some part of Jason keep existing in the world a little longer through him. It is, I'll admit, a story constructed carefully enough to almost work, delivered with enough genuine-looking grief that some small, exhausted part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to reach across the table and comfort a man drowning in a loss I could at least imagine the shape of. I might have believed it entirely, might have found some way to be angry and understanding at once, and eventually forgiven my way back into this relationship with a slightly different name attached to it if I hadn't already read that grief counselor's email with my own eyes, if the phrase continuing to use your brother's accounts hadn't specifically, deliberately implied a pattern stretching back, further than the 7 weeks I'd personally lived through. I asked him directly whether I was the first woman he'd done this with. He didn't answer right away, which was its own answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat in a way that scared me more than anything he'd said so far. He told me there had been a couple of others, his phrase, delivered with a strange, clinical distance, as though he were describing patients rather than women he'd built entire fabricated relationships with under a dead man's name. He said it never lasted long. He said something always eventually gave it away. A slip, a coincidence, someone from Jason's old life recognizing a face that shouldn't have still been circulating through the world attached to a stranger's number. I asked him, my voice shaking in a way I couldn't control by that point, what he did when it fell apart. What happened, exactly, in the space between one woman figuring it out and the next profile going up under his brother's name. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something about the pause made me regret asking before he'd even said a word. He told me he usually took a break, a few weeks, sometimes longer, to get his head right. That was the phrase he used, get his head right, and that eventually the apartment would get too quiet, and the grief counselor's emails would start piling up unread, and he'd find himself, almost without deciding to, opening the app again, scrolling through his brother's old photos, choosing the ones that made Jason look the most alive. I asked him if he'd ever told any of the others the truth voluntarily, the way he was telling me now, or if every single one of them had found out the way I had. By accident? By a slipped laptop screen? By a stranger at a grocery store who remembered a face that didn't belong to the name attached to it? He said no. He said I was the first one he'd actually explained himself to instead of just disappearing on. And for one brief, disorienting moment, sitting across that kitchen table from him, I felt something that horrified me more than anything else that night. A small, traitorous flicker of something like flattery, like being trusted with the truth, was its own kind of intimacy before the rest of me caught up and recognized it for what it actually was, which was simply a different, more sophisticated shape of the same manipulation that had gotten me into that kitchen in the first place. I left that night and I didn't go back. And for the first few days, I told myself the worst of it was simply the deception itself, the sheer violation of having built real feelings for a man who had never actually existed under the name I knew him by. I filed a report, mostly out of a sense that this needed to be documented somewhere official, even if I wasn't sure what crime, exactly, had been committed. And the officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but understandably uncertain what to actually do with a case built around a man using his own dead brother's identity rather than a stranger's. It was Melissa, the woman from the grocery store, the one who'd cut Jason's hair, who found me a week later, not by accident this time. She'd gotten my number from Amanda, who she'd tracked down through a mutual friend, and when she called, her voice had none of the warm, easy familiarity it had at the deli counter. It was careful, urgent, the voice of someone who had clearly rehearsed what she needed to say. She told me that she hadn't cut Jason's hair. Not really. She'd cut Chris's hair for almost a year, back when Chris had first started slipping into his brother's identity. She just hadn't known that at the time, because Chris had introduced himself to her from the very first appointment as Jason, and she'd had no reason to question it, because she'd never met the real Jason at all. She only found out the truth months into their own relationship, which had started, she told me, almost exactly the way mine had. An app, an easy connection, a man who seemed to understand grief and loneliness in a way that felt like it was speaking directly to her own. She told me she'd ended things the same week she'd found out, horrified, and had spent the year since trying to convince herself it had just been an unusually strange, unusually cruel act of grief. A man so broken by loss that he'd temporarily lost his own name in the process. She said she genuinely believed that, mostly, until 3 months ago, when a coworker of hers had mentioned, in passing, an old news article she'd stumbled across while looking up something unrelated. A small local story from Kentucky, almost 3 years old now, about a young man's death that the family had initially reported as a car accident, and that had later, quietly, without much follow-up coverage, been reclassified by investigators as an open case pending further review. I asked her what that meant, though some cold, sinking part of me had already started to understand. She said that as far as she'd been able to find, no formal charges had ever been filed, no arrest had ever been made, and the case had simply gone quiet the way small-town cases sometimes do when a family closes ranks and a community decides it's kinder not to keep asking questions. But she said the timeline had stuck with her ever since she'd read it. The accident that killed Jason Bennett had happened only 6 weeks before Chris first created the fake profile that eventually found her, as though whatever grief had driven him to become his brother had started forming almost the exact moment his brother stopped being able to stop him. Melissa told me something else that night too, something that had clearly been sitting heavy in her for a long time before she finally said it out loud to me. She said that near the end of her own relationship with him, before she knew any of the truth, back when he was still, as far as she understood it, simply Jason, there had been a night he drank more than she'd ever seen him drink, and had said something strange and slurred about his brother that she'd filed away at the time as ordinary sibling resentment. He'd said, "Chris always wanted what was mine, even now." She hadn't thought much of it in the moment, she told me, because plenty of people talk about difficult siblings that way, a little bitterly, a little dramatically, after a few drinks. It was only after everything came apart that she understood the sentence had been backward the entire time, that Chris hadn't been the brother he was complaining about. Chris was him. The Jason complaining about Chris wanting what was his had impossibly been Chris the entire time, slipping for one drunken moment out of the person he was pretending to be and into some fractured, resentful version of the brother he'd actually lost, as though even his own drunken complaints had gotten tangled up in whichever identity happened to be sitting closest to the surface that night. I asked her the question I'd been almost afraid to ask since she first mentioned the reclassified case, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I asked whether she thought Chris had actually done something to Jason, caused the accident, somehow, rather than simply losing him to bad luck and a patch of ice on a back road. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she finally did, her voice had lost all of its earlier composure. She said she didn't know, that she'd never let herself follow that thought all the way to the end because of where it led, but that she'd started to notice, the longer she sat with everything, how conveniently complete the takeover had been. How quickly, how thoroughly, how comfortably Chris had settled into a name and a face and an entire remaining life that had, until 6 weeks earlier, belonged to someone else entirely, someone who, by his own drunken slip of the tongue, he'd apparently spent years resenting. I didn't sleep much for the next several nights after that call. I kept circling back to something Chris. I still struggle to call him that. Even now, some old muscle memory in my chest still wanting to reach for the other name, had said to me at his kitchen table that last night, something I'd filed away at the time as simple, ordinary grief, but that now sat differently in my memory. He told me that he and Jason had never actually been close, not the way people assume twins are close, that there had been a long, complicated tension between them for years before the accident, something about a woman they'd both once been interested in back in Kentucky, something he'd said quickly and then moved past before I could ask a follow-up question. I went back to the police with everything. Melissa's account, the reclassified case in Kentucky, the pattern of at least 2 other women besides myself. The detective assigned to my case this time, a woman named Rachel Owens, was more thorough than I expected, and within a couple of weeks, she'd managed to get in touch with the original investigating department in Kentucky, reopening a conversation about a case that, as far as I could tell, had been sitting untouched for close to 2 years. I never got a clean resolution to any of it, and I think that's the part of this story I still have the hardest time making peace with, more than the deception, more even than Melissa's account of the same slow, careful ruin playing out a year before mine. The Kentucky case remains open, technically, the same word every detective in every story like mine seems to use, a word that means both something and almost nothing at the same time. Chris was never charged with anything related to his brother's death. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything beyond what amounted to a strange, unsettling pattern of behavior that wasn't, in itself, clearly illegal, using a dead man's photos and a dead man's name to build relationships with women who had no way of knowing they were speaking to a ghost replacement rather than the ghost himself. He did stop contacting me after Rachel Owens got involved, at least directly. But about 4 months after everything came apart, Amanda came home from a shift with a strange look on her face and told me she'd seen a profile on the app that had made her stomach drop. A man who looked almost, though not quite, like Jason's photos, a slightly different jawline, a different last name, a bio that mentioned, in the exact same careful, practiced cadence I remembered from those first messages, a brother he'd lost and didn't like to talk about yet. I don't know if it was actually him under a new name or a coincidence cruel enough to feel like one, or my own frightened mind finding a pattern in something that might have meant nothing at all. Amanda didn't message the profile to find out, and neither did I, and I've never checked the app again since that night, though I know, somewhere in the part of my brain that never fully stopped being afraid, that not knowing is its own kind of unfinished thing sitting quietly at the edge of my life. There's a detail I've never told anyone besides my therapist, one I still can't fully decide what to do with. A couple of weeks after I left him, going back through old photos on my own phone looking for anything I might have missed, I found a picture I'd forgotten I'd taken. A candid shot from our second date, him laughing at something across a table, caught mid-motion with his head tilted slightly to one side. I'd always assumed, without really examining it, that the slight asymmetry in his smile was just an ordinary quirk, the kind everyone has. It was only staring at that photo for a long time, weeks later, that I noticed something that made my stomach drop all over again. A thin, pale scar along his jawline, barely visible unless the light hit it exactly right, in exactly the spot where you'd expect a scar from a car accident's shattered window to leave one. I've never been able to prove what that scar means, and some nights I tell myself it means nothing at all, that plenty of people have small scars along their jaw from 100 unremarkable childhood accidents that have nothing to do with any of this. But other nights, the ones where sleep won't come no matter how long I lie still, I let myself follow the thought all the way to its worst possible ending. That the accident on that icy back road in Kentucky 3 years ago hadn't been quite as one-sided as the story I was told. That somewhere underneath the name Jason Bennett and the name Chris Bennett, there might be an entirely different, far more ordinary explanation than a saint who died and a monster who replaced him. One involving two brothers in the same car on the same night, and a choice made in some unbearable instant about which one of them was going to get to keep being the one who survived it. What stays with me most, more than the fear, more than the strange grief-shaped shame of having loved someone who wasn't real under the name I loved him as, is something Melissa said near the end of that first phone call, almost as an aside, in a voice that had gone very quiet. She said that in the years since she'd left him, she'd started to wonder whether Chris even remembered, underneath whatever had broken in him, that he wasn't actually his brother anymore. Whether some nights, deep enough into the performance, the line between the two of them had genuinely blurred for him, whether the man across the table from each of us had, in some real and terrible sense, stopped, being able to tell the difference between honoring the dead and simply becoming them. I think about that more than I'd like to admit, late at night, in the apartment I now share with a new roommate in a different part of the city, far enough from Jason's old neighborhood that I no longer worry about running into either version of him at a grocery store deli counter. I think about a man standing in a bathroom mirror somewhere, practicing a dead brother's easy laugh, a dead brother's specific way of holding a fork, a dead brother's exact voice saying my name for the first time at a diner that stayed open late enough to work around both our schedules, and I wonder how much of him is even left in there anymore, underneath all that borrowed grief, or whether that's precisely the question he spent 2 years, and however many women, trying not to have to answer. 2 weeks ago, Amanda came home and mentioned, almost in passing, that Melissa had reached out to her again. Not about Chris this time, but just checking in, the way you do with someone you've been through something with, even something you never wanted to share with anyone. She'd heard, secondhand, through someone who still lived near the family in Kentucky, that Chris had moved again, out of state this time, and that his mother, Linda, had stopped answering calls from anyone who used to know either of her sons. I don't know what that means. I've stopped expecting to ever fully know what any of it means. And some nights that not knowing sits on my chest like a physical weight, and other nights I manage to set it down long enough to actually sleep. What I do know is that somewhere out there, a man is very likely sitting across a table from another woman right now, in another city, wearing a dead man's easy laugh like a coat that's never quite fit him right, telling her some careful, practiced version of a loss that's true enough to break her heart and false enough, underneath it, to break something else entirely. I hope, if she's reading something like this one day, she gets out faster than I did. I hope she notices the small wrong thing. The too warm recognition at a grocery store, the text from a mother that doesn't fully make sense, the way his face changes for half a second before he catches himself, and that she trusts it enough to look closer before the orbit of her own happiness pulls it back into something she can talk herself out of one more time. I went back to therapy a few months after all of it, something I'd resisted at first, telling myself I was fine, that I'd only known him 7 weeks, that plenty of people went through worse without needing to sit in someone's office once a week talking about it. My therapist, a calm, unhurried woman named Diane Foster. No relation, she assured me, laughing gently, to anyone named Foster I'd ever have reason to worry about. Told me something in our 3rd or 4th session that I still turn over sometimes on the nights the not knowing gets loud. She said that what made this particular kind of betrayal so disorienting wasn't just that he'd lied about his name. People lie about plenty of things on those apps. Their height, their job, whether they're actually divorced. What made it different, she said, was that everything else about him had felt so real. The way he listened. The way he showed up for me on the worst night of a bad week without being asked twice. Whatever else Chris Bennett was, however many women had come before me, and however many might come after, the specific attention he'd paid me for those 7 weeks hadn't been an act in the ordinary sense of the word, not entirely. It had been real feeling borrowed and pointed in a stranger's direction, wearing a dead man's name because Chris no longer entirely trusted his own to deserve it. I don't know if that makes it better or infinitely worse. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Usually somewhere around 2 in the morning, lying awake in my new apartment with my new roommate asleep down the hall, listening to the specific, ordinary sounds of a building I've made sure, this time, that no one outside a small circle of people I trust completely actually knows the address of. Amanda still checks the app sometimes, more out of a kind of grim vigilance than curiosity, scrolling past profiles on nights she can't sleep, telling me if anything ever looks close enough to worry about. So far, since that one unsettling profile, 4 months after everything fell apart, there's been nothing else. No slightly different jawline, no careful, practiced bio about a brother he doesn't like to talk about yet. I want to believe that means it's over. That Chris Bennett has finally either gotten the help that grief counselor spent 2 years trying to get him to accept, or has simply run out of women willing to fall for the particular, well-worn shape of his performance. But I've learned, the hard way, not to trust the quiet too easily, not to mistake an absence of evidence for an absence of danger. And so instead of relief, what I mostly feel these days is something closer to a permanent, low-grade readiness. The kind you carry the way you'd carry a house key in your pocket. Not thinking about it constantly, but always, somewhere in the back of your mind, aware of exactly where it is.
Thank you for watching, and what do you think about that stories? I hope you enjoy and see you on the next video. Bye.